Hey everyone, welcome to Judging for the Win. I'm Dave, and this is my daily ruling. Today's question comes to us straight out of the Judge Vault, and the answer has changed recently, so I'm redoing an old DDR to cover the updated information. Amy plays a land for the turn, and Nick points out that Amy forgot to put a lore counter on her Urza Saga that she played last turn. What is the appropriate infraction, penalty, and fix? Well, before we talk about all of that, let's make sure that we're all on the same page regarding what was supposed to happen. The very first thing that's supposed to happen during a player's main phase is for that player to put a lore counter on all sagas that they control. This happens before that player gets priority in the main phase, meaning it is not possible to cast a sorcery or play a land before that counter is put on. Sagas have chapter abilities that trigger and do something when the lore counters are put on them. Those abilities count as triggered abilities, but actually physically putting the counter on the sagas is something else. The official game term for it is a turn-based action. Some other examples of turn-based actions are untapping your permanents and drawing a card for the turn. Now, so in my original video, I said that this looked an awful lot like a simple case of a missed trigger, but it's actually a little bit more complicated than that because the thing that actually puts the counters on at the start of your main phase is not a triggered ability. It's a turn-based action, like we said before. That means forgetting about it would not fall under the section of missed trigger in the infraction procedure guide, but rather a game rule violation, similar to what would happen if a player forgot to declare a damage assignment order, or discard down to their maximum hand size, which are also turn-based actions. The problem is that having something that behaves largely similar to triggered abilities in every way except for one is a big headache. This is why templating is so important. In the case of sagas, literally every other thing in Magic that puts a counter on a permanent every turn was a triggered ability. So it was really awkward every time a judge had to explain how sleeping a Saga counter was handled different from sleeping an Ether Vial counter. Now this was exacerbated by another issue that has to do with how game rule violations are handled. See, there are actually 3 possible fixes for a GRV that are supported by Magic's policy documents at Competitive Realm. The judge can issue a backup to the point of the error, or rule the game state should be left as is. The third option is a partial fix, where certain specific rulings have a special fix designed for exactly that infraction, which just fixes what went wrong without having any other effects on the game the way a backup would. Most other turn-based actions that it's plausible that someone might forget have a partial fix. Forget to untap a permanent during your untap step? Just untap it now. Forget to declare a damage assignment order? Do it now. Forget to draw for turn or discard to max hand size? You guessed it, do it now. Forget to put a lore counter on a saga? Nope, I got nothing for you. Quite literally, in fact, since many instances where this happened were noticed only after significant game actions had taken place, making a backup infeasible. With no partial fix available, the only option left in these cases was for the game to continue with the game state being left as is. Eventually, enough was enough, and the policy was changed. Now, forgetting the turn-based action of putting a lore counter on a saga is handled exactly like forgetting a triggered ability. The appropriate fix is to proceed with the game state left as is if the game has progressed to the next player's combat phase. If the error is caught before then, Amy's opponent would get the choice of whether to have Amy put the lore counter on immediately or proceed with the game state left as is. If the lore counter is put on, that would cause the appropriate chapter ability on the saga to trigger as normal. Now, one interesting fact is that putting a lore counter on your saga as it enters the battlefield is a replacement effect. That means forgetting to do that is also a GRV. This aspect is not changing at all, and it still gets handled exactly the same as it always did. Only forgetting to add a counter at the start of your main phase is handled as a missed trigger. I'll talk more about my thoughts on that at the end of the video. Another thing that I want to make clear is that nothing is changing about the mechanics of what's officially happening in the game. The only thing that's different is the policy around what a player should do if they forget to add the lore counter during that specific time. The penalty for a missed trigger is normally a warning, but that's only if the trigger is generally considered to be detrimental for its controller. Putting a lore counter on your saga might bring it closer to getting sacrificed, but in general it's not detrimental. To the contrary, you play the sagas specifically because the abilities that you get as you advance through the chapters are beneficial. Accordingly, there is no penalty for forgetting to put a lore counter on your saga. Now, this is true even in a case where it might happen to be strategically disadvantageous to put that counter on. The penalty for missed trigger is based on the general case for that trigger, and does not take into account any particulars about the game that the infraction occurred in. Bear in mind that this is true only if you committed the infraction accidentally. If a judge believes that a player intentionally missed putting a counter on your Saga to derive some sort of strategic benefit, for example, to be able to get an extra construct token out of that Urza Saga, well, that would constitute cheating and merit a disqualification. The judge must investigate thoroughly and carefully consider this alternative because, especially now, the stakes are very high. It's definitely possible for a player to make an innocent mistake, even a suspicious one, and the difference is quite literally the difference between a DQ and a simple caution to play more carefully. I have several videos where I simulate and break down this sort of scenario if you'd like some guidance on how a judge might make that determination. Speaking of cheating, there's another concept that I feel like I should cover. In the question from the original problem statement, Nick called a judge immediately upon noticing that Amy had forgotten to put a lore counter on her Saga. But what would happen if he didn't? The change in how Sagas are handled also changed the answer to this question. The current correct answer is that it is not an infraction for Nick to allow the game to continue, even if he realizes that Amy has forgotten to put a lore counter on her Saga, and even if he knows that putting that counter on is not optional. This is because declining to call attention to an opponent's missed trigger is never considered failure to maintain game state or cheating, which is what the infraction would have been for Nick under that old policy. This is always a contentious topic whenever I bring it up, partly because it's different from how a lot of other TCGs handle analogous situations, and partly because it goes against the social contract a lot of players in context other than competitive rel like to follow. Nonetheless, based on Magic's current policy documents, what I just said is the correct ruling. I made a video called How to Rules Lawyer Your Opponent, where I talked about this topic in a lot more detail, so I'll refer you to that video if you'd like a fuller explanation behind this policy and the reasoning behind it. Speaking of rules enforcement level, I should mention that thus far everything I've said applies to competitive. At a regular rules enforcement level, such as an FNM or a pre-release, I would still probably rule the exact same way though. I like the idea of using the competitive rel fix as a starting point since it's usually better defined, and adjusting the severity if appropriate, which I think what we have is a perfectly fine for a regular rel environment too. With all that said, I want to close out by commenting on this change and what I think some of the implications are. I'm not exaggerating when I say this is the most significant policy change in recent memory, both in terms of how different the old fix was and how frequently I expect this scenario to come up. That being the case, I think it is appropriate to have a little bit of scrutiny for what changed. Sagas were first released over 5 years ago, and I still remember thinking it was completely baffling why they worded them the way that they did. My original video on this topic even had a jab about how literally every other Magic card in history that put a counter on something every turn used a triggered ability to do it, and it was completely stupid that Sagas were any different. I still stand by those comments, and I have a bunch of theories about why Wizards decided to word them this way, as well as why they triggered during your main phase rather than the upkeep, which again was how every other card up to that point did it. I'm still not completely sold on any one specific theory, so I'll just keep those to myself and comment based on what I know. Over the last several years, the fact that Sagas were not handled as mistriggers led to a lot of frustration and confusion for judges and players alike, so I definitely think that this change is a step in the right direction. That said, in my opinion, it's still not quite the best case scenario yet. Having a situation where something that is not a triggered ability gets handled like one is a little weird, and if I was made the unilateral dictator of Magic rules and policy, I would get rid of the turn-based action entirely and change the CR so that each chapter ability would be worded something like, at the beginning of your pre-combat main phase, put a lore counter on this Saga, then if it has end lore counters, do the effect. This wording would make it so that putting the lore counter on the Saga is a triggered ability, and it's part of the same triggered ability that the effect is, meaning that digital players wouldn't have to click through a second dialog box, which is one of my guesses as to why the counter was designed as a turn-based action. Since my wording would make it a bona fide triggered ability, we wouldn't need an awkward statement in the IPG where something that isn't a trigger gets handled by one. On the other hand, we would still have the same issue that we have currently, where the first counter is a replacement effect, but the remaining ones are not. I don't really mind this so much because cards that enter the battlefield with a counter on them historically have always done this via a replacement effect. So Sagas are synced up to how the normal way to put counters on them would be for both those cases. It is a little bit sad that they can't all be the same, but at least there exists a simple philosophy that each aspect is following. To be clear, from a policy perspective, I think we're exactly where we should be. It's just that I'd like the rules to change so that we don't have to make an exception in our policy documents in order to make that happen. Perhaps after a while of handling sagas in this new way, if there aren't any major issues that come up, Wizards will do exactly that, and I'll have to make a third video on this same topic explaining that change, which of course I would be happy to do. But that's all I have for you today. How did you do? Join me again next time for another daily ruling. Until then, I hope you have a great day.